For us, it's really starting with that discovery period of where are people talking? And then going in and, to borrow a Jane Goodall kind of element, we're living among the gorillas.
Hello and welcome to the Healthtech Marketing Podcast, brought to you by Health Launchpad and HIMSS. Hi, I am Adam Chirinas, Health Launchpad founder and CEO, and your host for today. I want to give a big thank you to my partner HIMSS for helping me put this together, and also a big thank you to you for joining us today, for listening and subscribing. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our guest, a really unique guy, Dean Browell. Dean is the Chief Behavioral Officer, hard to say, of Feedback. And Feedback is an ethnographic firm, which is kind of an unusual thing. And what he does is just fascinating and is really relevant in healthcare. So Dean, welcome to the show. Tell us about yourself and Feedback. And then what the heck does an ethnographic firm do?
Thanks so much, Adam, for having me. And yeah, absolutely. So my background, I've got more of an academic one. I've got a Ph.D. specifically looking at how different generations interact online. So already, I start from this academic place of nerdiness around generations. But when I was working on that, I really fell in love with ethnography and just that idea of observation. And what I ended up doing was applying that in an online space. And so that's really the genesis, conceptually of what Feedback does, which is apply a behavioral science eye to the online space and online interactions. And I'm being really broad there because, if I say just social listening, people just think Facebook and Instagram and things, and it does include those things. But it also includes much deeper behavior. And especially speaking of healthcare, think condition-specific message boards, and places, and for example, message boards where nurses are talking, and so it's been a really fascinating ride. We've been at this for about 13 years, and then really applying this behavioral science side to online behavior and working with all different kinds of folks in the healthcare world.
Well, so. Make this real for us. Give us an example of this in action. You mentioned nurses, and I remember talking about that. That's a really, boy, is that a relevant example these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you a couple quick ones on both that internal and external side. So on the internal side, something that, it was already something to be studying prior to COVID, but of course with COVID, studying clinician burnout. And looking at that through the lens of how nurses talk to one another about where they work, how they're feeling at the moment. Also then with physicians as well. That's one of the ways that we're applied is to take a look at, how is that internal workforce talking about living and working, what that means for company culture, other aspects like DEIA as well. How is that represented in how they talk to one another? And then the elephant in the room then is also how that influences that new recruit who's doing their homework before they sign up to become a nurse at an organization. So that's an internal side. And on the external side, it might be, for example, looking down a service line and saying, what do cancer patients and those who are recently diagnosed, what's their journey like in our region of where we serve? How do they feel about us, for a hospital or hospital system? How do they feel about that? How do they feel about competitors? So it can be used on that sort of, gazing inward or outward in an organization, but using that same technique.
So I'm guessing that most of our listeners are familiar with kind of traditional qualitative and quantitative types of research. So just kind of dimensionalize how this is different. What is it that you do that's kind of different and special here?
Absolutely. So it's interesting because we do a lot of work with market research firms and partnerships that we have with our clients as well. And so a great way I always describe it is to say, surveys are fantastic at telling you what a problem might be and telling you about the what. Whereas I think more qualitative aspects can be a bit more about the why. And that's really the approach that we take. Similarly then, when we're paired up with, say, a survey, group, what we might often do is the survey, telling you a good deal of what people will say when they're prompted, we're then going to go and say, okay, here's what they actually say out in the wild. And if there's a gap there, you really want to know that. If you're doing a preference study, for example. But also the other way to put it, and another example I'd love to use is NPS scores. Would you recommend, a brand? I don't want to know just would you recommend. I want to know, do you? And that's where we come in, is to really be able to look at, do people actually recommend you? Do they actually, how are you compared with your competitors? And that's where I think there's an interesting opportunity in what we do to illustrate, what might be out there, whether that's misinformation, whether that's understanding, one way to think about it, for example, is with personas. You may have a kind of personas, that you typically would pursue for marketing reasons, for recruitment, whatever that might be. Let's find out how they actually act out in the wild. Who do they actually listen to? Where do they hang out? What are those channels? What are they saying? And so for us, it's trying to sort of flesh out a complete picture of what's said unprompted, in addition to what you might already be doing research-wise, with more prompted things such as surveys and whatnot.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up personas. I've been using personas now for 20 something years. I think there's sort of pros and cons to them. And I think the part of the issue, the weakness of them is that typically they're developed, internally, right? So they're developed by the marketing team, maybe with the help of an agency. And the sort of dimension is kind of what you know. What I find is actually what I try to do with personas is like, okay, you get the persona, and we'll go out and find on LinkedIn and find people that look like the people that we're talking about. So make them real. But that's sort of like, it's pretty, two-dimensional. What we then do is then look at the buyer journey. So, and specifically the notion of like, what are the questions that they have at the different stages of the buyer journey, and what are their behaviors, and what are their, what's the information that they're looking for. But again, we're doing that based on, what we think we know rather than what we know. How would you kind of inform a process like that?
No, that's a great question. I think you're illustrating, a lot of the potential barriers with personas. The other one I would just add is that often they end up getting so segmented by generation, which can be very awkward because generations are so broad. But I can't tell you how many personas we've been given where there's like a millennial Millie is like one of the personas, and it just covers this, 25 to 40-year-old, which of course, from a healthcare standpoint, that's some very different universes you might be in terms of healthcare then. But yeah, what we typically do, I'd say it sort of takes two elements to it. One is just illustrating how do they actually act when they're talking among peers. And that could end up changing your perspective on personas. Because, for example, we may end up saying these two personas may buy differently, right? They may have slightly different journeys, but online they mix. They appear in the same places. They're taking advice from one another. We also then, the other thing I would say is that we can also identify spoiler personas. So these may be personas that are not large in numbers, but they are tremendous effectors of that journey, right? They may be there. I'll give you this funny example, but we did work outside of healthcare with Micron and looking at IT managers and things like that. But one of the things we identified for them was this entirely other persona that they really needed to know about, because if they treated them the way they treated everyone else, they could rake them across the coals in terms of PR or the way that they might point things out online. And, for us, it was about identifying, look, these are the people that are actually out there affecting these decisions. So from a persona standpoint, it's getting to know them better. It's, who asks questions, who answers them. And sometimes that could be different types of peers, as well as then, where are they? What are the major channels? And where are those? How could we help to flesh out that treatment journey or that patient journey, if it's a patient persona? How can we flesh that out and fill in holes that we don't typically have, especially, thinking about the other kind of research people typically do. It's often post-transaction, if you will, right? I mean, it's so what we often don't have is that beginning part. And I'm reminded of work that we did with Arkansas Children's, where we would take a look at, say, a service line, maybe it's neurology, and say, okay, how do parents with kids with these neurological issues, how do they just operate in the state of Arkansas? What's their biggest pain points? How do they find community? And what we might help flesh out is to say, for example, well, there's a lot of information and great community when you're first diagnosed. But what they really don't have is a support system when that child becomes a teenager with this issue. And so being able to identify gaps like that may help then where there could be great content, great connection points. But it just really helps, I think, paint that bigger picture for those personas as well.
That's just so interesting, the way that you talked about it. Yeah, I want to kind of go back to your IT example. So many of the folks who are listening to this are selling technology, and the IT folks in the healthcare system are an important part of this. The biggest challenge, in business to business sales is the notion of the buyer collective. And that's even worse in healthcare because the buyer collectives are so much larger and it's very consensus driven and the sales cycles are really long. How does, what you do help with, helping an organization figure out actually who should they be selling to and what's the kind of collective behavior of the buyer collective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's interesting. It's interesting to me that what we do is so applicable, even in, say, some of those B2B scenarios too. And when you're trying to attract the attention of, but then also just truly understand, for example, that whole concept of who asks questions and who answers. Sometimes that could be in a bit of a vacuum, right? I mean, it could be that they're only asking peers directly adjacent to them. In other cases, they might be talking about the fact that, like, let's say if it's a B2B situation, and it's about, they may gripe about procurement. No matter what I choose, it's going to have an uphill battle internally until we finally settle on a price and we're able to make this purchase, for example. And so they might talk about the other players. And so for us, that's where that ethnographic piece really comes in. One of the things I loved about ethnography first was the rich descriptions that and the writing that went into it. But then the second element of ethnography I love is sort of following all the rabbit trails. And so that's the other element here, is that we could hear about their decision-making process, but then at the same time, we might also find out where are their barriers, and that might lead us to other groups that have totally different discussions. Procurement may be on a totally different, channel or board or talking amongst themselves, griping about the fact that they keep getting recommendations that they can't fill, or whatever the case may be. So part of it is to really get in there and understand that who's influencing those questions, what are their opportunities, their challenges. Sometimes, for example, we've seen things where it may be a very particular kind of peer. So, for example, it may be someone who's late stage career that's doing all the answering of questions, but it's only the newer folks that are ones asking. And so, I will always say 0 is a data point. So, for example, if we don't see someone talking, I want to know, why is that? Is it because they're at a different channel? Is it because they're just not a part of this decision making in the way that people are illustrating it? And so that's one of the things I love to do, is sort of really find out, we find those gaps, whether it's someone talking about, and for example, it may be based on size of institution, right? It could be that rural hospital who's trying to make that same kind of purchase that, say, a much larger system somewhere else is making, they, talking to that other peer at that larger institution may be no help to them, right? They only want to talk to those who have the same, setups and scenarios and situations that they do. And so just seeing how they divide, I think, could be fascinating.
So again, how do you go about doing this? I know, you're doing online research. Just tell me about some of the techniques, the ethnographic techniques that you use.
Absolutely. I'll use a patient example, a cancer patient example. I think this might be kind of interesting. We did some work for a cancer center in Arizona, and that's important as a geographical element, because geography really does play into what we do. And so our teams are made up of people, they're led by anthropologists. And so it's starting from this idea that this is about people, right, and understanding how they're behaving. And so our team then would, for example, in that Arizona example, go in and say, okay, if you have cancer and you live in Arizona, where do you talk? Where do you talk about it? Where do people talk about, specifically, it could be around, the brand names, if you will, of the cancer centers in Arizona, but it also could be around certain types of cancer. And seeing where are people self-identifying that, hey, I live in Arizona and I have breast cancer or I have prostate cancer, whatever the case may be. In that particular example was fascinating because what we kept finding is that there weren't local groups, not like we normally see. In many cities, we'll see, the affinity groups, right? I mean, this is what hospitals used to be the best at, was pulling people together with the same diagnosis, right, and have these affinity groups. Well, in some areas, and we found in this particular part of Arizona, there were very few local groups. And so what that meant was, if you had a particular kind of cancer, for example, you would end up on a national group for that kind of cancer. Let's say it's breast cancer. It could be breastcancer.org, which has an incredible forum where people talk all about what they're going through and they stick around and help those who have just been diagnosed. The problem there is if you're asking for a doc recommendation and you're on a national channel like that, you're going to hear crickets. Right? Because you'd be lucky if someone happens to be in Arizona, right, and happens to see your post. So not having that local affinity group is important. And so in that particular case, for that client, they may say, well, this is a great opportunity for us to create that channel, to be able to create a community there. And if we're looking even deeper, and this is what, our anthropologists were able to find, is it's because so many snowbirds live in Arizona. Right? There are members of communities back in the Northeast or wherever they came from, right? And that's where their community is based. And so that's part of it, is they don't have that same geographic community group. But so for us, it's really starting with that discovery period of where are people talking, and then going in and, to borrow a Jane Goodall kind of element, we're living among the gorillas, right? We're in there, we're studying, we're capturing great examples. And even though we're a qualitative research technique, it becomes quantitative when you start looking at thousands of posts. So it's really kind of a fascinating blend of that like qualitative and quantitative enterprise, but it really is driven by that behavioral science, like anthropological kind of.
I love the notion of living among the gorillas. I'm not sure I necessarily want. Yeah. That's very funny. Dean, this has really been very interesting. It's a very different perspective on, how to think about customer insight and buying behavior. It's not something I think that many people would be doing, but I can see how organizations that might be really stuck in trying to understand buying behavior would sort of gravitate towards this. So it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. Now, before we go, I've got a question I need to ask you, and it's the question I ask all the guests, and that is, if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be? And it can be anything. It can be personal, it can be professional, it can be like last week, it could be 40 years ago.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. So for me, I would say to never write a channel off. Never assume that a group is dead. One thing we've definitely learned is that, for example, we'll come across a patient group. Actually, it's the employees that we find. So like, let's say a nursing group that started out as an IRC chat room, in the early 90s. And then it was an AOL message board group. And then it was a Yahoo group. And then now it's some other kind of forum or message board. And I think that early on when we started, we kept thinking like, oh, we have to be on the cutting edge of social media and all the newest channels. And we are. We do that. But I can't tell you how many groups we end up looking at, and you look at the history of it. They might have an about page, and they're like, "We've been a group since 1997," and you're like, "Wow,
Good
okay." This isn't about the latest and greatest internet. Sometimes it's about these people with the same interests.
Oh yeah,
sticking around.
I mean, I've heard people bring up listserv.
Right, absolutely.
That's IRC. Wow, that's a step back in the time machine, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the internet time machine there, right there. You'll be talking about CompuServe and Prodigy next.
That's right. Here you go. Exactly. You could already hear the dial-up sound of joining your modem.
Oh, shudder. Well, Dean, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your insights today. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks.
So before we go, I wanted to let everybody who's either listening or watching the video that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple, on Spotify. Actually, I think it's on all the podcast channels. If it's not, let me know. And you can also, if you're listening to this and you want to see he's a very good-looking chap, Dr. Browell, or Mr. Browell. So you can see him actually on the video online on my blog on healthlaunchpad.com. I just got a favor to ask, which is, if you like this and you think that other people in your community would value it, recommend this to just 2 people. Just pass along the link or make a suggestion to 2 people. I'd really appreciate it. And as ever, I'm always looking for great guests, great ideas, things that you think the community would value. So if you've got one, email me at adam@healthlaunchpad.com. That's adam@healthlaunchpad.com. So thank you for listening, and have a great rest of the day.